New and refined art, irrespective of its form, inherently draws inspiration from its predecessors, and thus is differentiated by the subtle nuances that are ultimately a reflection of societal context, cultivating innovation through insight and values. Through Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones's Diary, the two novels epitomize the transcendence of love, marriage, as well as individuality, and imperatively, the changes within a social paradigm that reflect a social context. The foil of Elizabeth Bennet, Bridget Jones, reveals a drastic change in agency and societal expectations with regards to women, and thus reinforces the nature of literature being a mirror of social evolution. Jane Austen's 1813 novel Pride and Prejudice was composed during early 19th century England, and in the midst of the Regency period, in which warfare was pervasive throughout Europe and was somewhat symbolic of a transitional period from Enlightenment towards Romanticism, through literature and more so arts in general. Similarly, during the time of writing, the novel itself epitomized the introduction and cultivation of feminist literature within Western Europe. Written in third-person form, the novel serves to critique the absurdity of social expectations of women during the 19th century pertaining to marriage and the negation of individuality in favor of conformity. Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones's Diary is a satirical novel set in the late 20th century of London following a middle-class woman in her 30s struggling to attain autonomy over her life in every facet, whether it's gaining self-control, eradicating her vices, and abstaining from succumbing to the perpetual trap of emotionally distant men. Drawing direct influence from Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the novel epitomizes the tribulations faced within femininity in a modern-day context, and thus emulates the hindrances and social mores of the 19th century, and the expectations enforced with the social constructs within each respective time period, albeit with more freedom. Pride and Prejudice reveals the fixation of marriage and the expectations placed upon women that coincided with such during the Regency period. Perceived as a means of elevating one's economic status, the pursuit of marriage from Elizabeth Bennet's family and larger society depict Elizabeth's inherent disinterest in finding a suitor. A heavy contrast to the notion that women merely desired marriage for fulfillment. Notably, the novel offers insights into the perspectives of both men and women pertaining to the nature of marriage, and thus it is evident through the dialogue between Elizabeth and Mr. Collins, in which Mr. Collins offers a proposal. Mr. Collins' proposition is rejected, and he proceeds to ignorantly state, "As I must therefore conclude that you are not serious in your rejection of me, I shall choose to attribute it to your wish of increasing my love by suspense, according to the usual practice of elegant females. The asyndeton encapsulates the naivety and sheer inability of men to accept refusal, and more notably, the conception that marriage with Elizabeth is merely transaction and not the culmination of love." Preceding such a disastrous interaction, Mr. Collins begins his pursuit of Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend, and ultimately proposes to her. Once again, not out of love, but out of asset. Charlotte's decree of, "I am not romantic, you know I never was, I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins' character, connection, and situation in life, I'm convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." The lexical chain of what is essentially a repetition of rational thought as opposed to love is indicative of the extent to which women sought matrimony for prosperity. Contrary to the prior proposal to Elizabeth, the proposal involving Charlotte takes into account both parties within what is more of a financial arrangement than a marriage, and the reasons for such. Charlotte, conscious of her age at 27, albeit young within a modern context, desperately wants to evade the dogma of a housemaid, and thus accepts. Ultimately, matrimony within what is an allegory, Pride and Prejudice, proves to be decisive in dictating the choices one makes, whether it's acceptance or refusal, and imperatively accentuates the notion that women simply wanted to be married, when in actuality it was more so imposed upon oneself. From a contemporary perspective, Helen Fielding's appropriation amplifies the desire for marriage both on the part of an individual and societal pressure, while simultaneously displaying the evolution of agency in womanhood. Despite Bridget's propensity for marriage with the realization of her age and relationship status, her courses of action within various facets of life prioritize her desires and aspirations, but also exacerbates her vices in regard to love. Parallels can be drawn between the strong influence of both Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Jones with regards to their respective daughters settling down and fostering a family and a marriage. However, within the appropriation, the autonomy within modern womanhood becomes apparent. The dramatic irony within Mrs. Jones stating, "Well, darling, I mean at your age, I know Mark is a little reserved, but you could bring him out of himself. He's very rich." It is not just a reflection of Mrs. Jones's nature, but society's nature as a collective. The very essence of such proves the transcendence of both individual and societal pressure on women to be married and to succumb to conformity. Whilst Bridget is met with a similar rigidity to social expectations, it is the acceptance of modern customs, such as casual dating with Daniel. Once Daniel's infidelity is discovered by Bridget, she decrees a humorous metaphor of Daniel having the emotional intelligence of a teaspoon. The use of such metaphor provides Bridget with an epiphany that she should truly halt her seemingly perpetual pursuit of emotionally unavailable men, and use it as effectively a learning curve, through which she ultimately meets Mark Darcy, and both parties mutually fall in love with each other. While some argue that Bridget's narration is weak and undermines women, I believe the contrary, and thus is further supported by Mississippi State University English professor Kelly Marsh, and her reading in that the recordings of Bridget's failures is what creates an assertive narrative. Fielding uses modern femininity to reflect the way in which making mistakes, in this instance, Bridget and her dating past, as a means of realization, and thus eventually finding true love within, which would have been implausible in a Regency era context. Prior to the 19th century, English society prioritized communal norms over individual expression. However, during Austen's lifetime, there was a growing emphasis on individualism in moral philosophy and personal experience. This shift created an increasing tension between rationale, thought, and emotional response. The novel suddenly proved to garner vast support and attention within its era, proving to be fundamental in its expression of values previously inexistent. Similarly, University of Notre Dame Professor Alistair MacIntyre, within his article A History of Addicts, argues that the novel materialized with its stress on individuality. Such is evident through the means of Elizabeth and the extent to which she seeks for self-reflection and contemplation within both the trivial and the tribulations of a life at Longbourn Estate. Within chapter 37, the innate rationale of Elizabeth begins to emerge as she reduces her pride and seeks remorse for her preconceptions surrounding the integrity of Darcy and her prejudice for him that ultimately dissipates. The tone of "not a day went by without a solitary walk, in which she might indulge in all the delight of unpleasant recollections," exudes irony as Elizabeth comes to acceptance that Darcy is right in his disdain for the Bennet family. An individual within the novel who isn't without vices nor controversy, but clearly maintains her own individuality, is the overlooked character of Lydia Bennet. The foreshadowing of Elizabeth's statements that will ensue as true. However, the pejorative tone fosters a commonality between a modern audience. Disdain of all restraint, and her exuberant spirits are merely epitomizing the nature of a 16-year-old girl. To Elizabeth and 19th century society as a whole, it can be perceived as a transgression, yet for a current audience, it is rather a refreshing strength of character. Through the medium of the Bennet sisters, the audience is able to accrue an understanding of the characters and their muses, yet limitations in which they seek to overcome, ultimately rendering a more profound understanding of context and time period. Fielding's appropriation heavily reiterates the individuality within the heroine. However, contrarily, the novel connotes the individual's desire to assimilate and succumb to society's idyllic women that counterintuitively reveals individuality. It is a struggle for conformity that reveals Bridget is inherently flawed, making her relatable for the modern-day audience. Both Pride and Prejudice and Bridget Jones's Diary reveal a desire for women to conform, but in doing so, the discrepancy between the motives behind both Bridget and Elizabeth are tuned to contextual nuances. Elizabeth's vices are apparent, and a narration suggests that there are a multitude of them, whether it's body image issues or overcoming addiction. The trope pertaining to body image issues is pervasive throughout Bridget's, inflicting self-deprecation upon herself, such as, "Now I feel empty and withered, 18 years of calorie and fat unit-based arithmetic, 18 years of buying long shirts and sweaters, and leaving the room backwards in intimate situations to hide my bottom." It is Bridget's self-acceptance of her flaws that juxtaposes her prior worries within an endless world of calories. Such obsession is present within a daily routine, revealing that at 7 a.m. she used to weigh herself, and that at 7:30 she used to return to bed in sulk overweight, revealing the low sense of self-esteem that Bridget once had, unforeseen in Elizabeth. As such, parallels between Bridget and Elizabeth remain constant within society's idiosyncratic expectations of women, and its enduring prevalence remain, albeit with different nuances reflective of the evolution of societies and individuals. Bridget's individuality is portrayed through humorous and deprecating monologue. Consequently, Austen's Pride and Prejudice reveals its sheer longevity through its transcendent values and aspects within its era that remain present and conspicuous today. Central to the novel is the notion that women are subjugated to society's shackles of mundanity in relation to marriage and love, in turn stripping the individuality and personal agency from women during the period. Despite its relevance, the innate ideas within the novel are heavily subverted within Helen Fielding's appropriation of Bridget Jones's diary. Thus, the disparities between each narrative are indicative of the evolution of aforementioned social values and pressures that coincide with such, specifically from society and family. The more contemporary struggles faced by Bridget and women, such as body image issues, are irrefutably more relatable for their modern audience. Classic art, in this instance, Pride and Prejudice, acts as a catalyst for innovation through Bridget and Elizabeth's collective experiences within different mediums and social constructs.